Do you believe people can really change? Or do they just get better at hiding things?
My birthday gift was a used candle and a lecture about gratitude. I said nothing, but at dinner, I let my sister drink from the cup meant for me. When she slumped forward, everyone looked at me. I just pushed my plate away. You probably think I'm joking or exaggerating for effect or trying to sound dramatic like some washed-up villain in a cheap movie, but that's what actually happened, and I'm not embellishing a damn thing. That's the real story, and the beginning of the end started earlier that same day, somewhere around 6 in the evening, when I walked into my mother's kitchen and smelled that god-awful turkey meatloaf she insists on making for special occasions. As though dry poultry and ketchup are an appropriate way to say I love you. I had just finished working a full shift at the elementary school front office, where I sort late slips, try not to get coughed on by second graders, and smile at parents who only acknowledge me when they need something faxed. 47 years old. No husband. No kids. No big job. And certainly no cake waiting for me when I got home. I had told myself, like I do every year, that I didn't care, that birthdays were just for children and attention seekers, and that I had aged out of being celebrated a long time ago. But the truth is, I remembered every single birthday where they forgot, or pretended to forget, or just didn't give a damn because Emily's party was the week after and we'll do something for both of you then. The kitchen was dim when I walked in, one of the bulbs flickering in that way that makes you think time is slowing down. My mother stood at the counter stirring something beige and unappetizing. She greeted me like a neighbor she hadn't seen in a while, polite, cool, distant. My sister was already there, sitting on the bar stool like she owned the place, legs crossed, scrolling on her phone with that smug little smirk she never really grew out of. Emily, 39 years old, successful marketing director, married to a man with too much hair gel and a smile that could sell dog food to a cat. She had perfect teeth, a perfect kitchen, and a daughter named Lily who called me Karen instead of Auntie because her mother once said it was more respectful. Emily looked up, gave me a once-over, and then held out a small gift bag like it was a favor she was doing me, not a gesture of celebration. I took the bag, already knowing from the weight of it that whatever was inside had no thought behind it. And I was right. A candle. A half-used, dust-coated vanilla-scented candle with wax stains down the side, and the wick burned halfway down. I stared at it for a moment, thinking maybe there was a joke attached, a hidden gift card, a note. But no, just the candle. And a slow, deliberate lecture about finding joy in the little things and remembering how lucky we are to have each other. Have you ever gotten a gift so insulting, so passively cruel, that it said more than any insult ever could? Something that felt like a joke only you weren't in on? What did you do? Did you stay quiet like I did? Or did you do something worse? I stood there, holding that pathetic little candle, and I smiled. I nodded. I even thanked her, though my mouth felt like it was full of sand. My mother chimed in from the stove, echoing something about humility and how Emily always gets everyone the most practical things, like that somehow excused it. I said nothing. I didn't ask why no one had bothered to get a cake. I didn't ask why there weren't any balloons or cards or effort. I just tucked that anger into the same place I'd been storing all the other slights for the last 4 decades. Right between the time they forgot to invite me on their beach trip and the time Emily's kids scratched my car and no one offered to pay for it. We sat down for dinner about 20 minutes later. Jason arrived late, blaming traffic, kissed Emily on the cheek, nodded vaguely at me. Lily didn't look up from her iPad. My mother had set the table with her usual mismatched china and poured cheap boxed wine into the tall glasses she only brings out for holidays and Emily's baby showers. I noticed that one of the glasses, the one set at my place, had a faint oily film around the rim, like it hadn't been rinsed properly. I quietly switched it with the one at Emily's seat, making sure no one noticed. Not because I planned anything, not yet at least. Just because. Just to feel like I had chosen something. Even if it was just a cup. Dinner was stale conversation about Emily's promotion, Jason's new investment property, Lily's latest dance recital. No one asked about my job, or how my car had broken down last week, or whether I was doing okay after another lonely holiday. I chewed slowly, drinking only water, listening to my mother fuss about her cholesterol pills and Emily laugh at a joke Jason made that wasn't even funny. I felt invisible, like a coat rack with a pulse. Then, mid-sentence, Emily stopped laughing. Her voice faltered. She blinked hard, like she couldn't quite focus. Her hand twitched slightly, knocking over her fork. She looked around the table, confused, like she didn't know where she was. My mother asked her if she was okay, reaching out, but Emily didn't answer. She swayed forward, one hand bracing the edge of the table, and then her head tilted strangely to the side. And just like that, she slumped forward. Not dramatically. Not like in a movie. More like someone deflating slowly. Her cheek hit the edge of her plate, and the room went quiet in that heavy, sticky way that makes your skin feel too tight. Jason stood up first, shouting her name, grabbing her shoulders, shaking her gently. My mother screamed. Lily finally looked up, her little face pale and scared. And me? I just sat there. I pushed my plate slightly away from me, careful not to spill anything, and said nothing. Because this wasn't an accident. This wasn't food poisoning. This wasn't some tragic stroke of fate. This was what happened when someone finally noticed the glass wasn't where it was supposed to be. And I was just getting started. There is something strangely poetic, almost absurdly theatrical, about the moment when a room full of people who have never truly seen you suddenly look at you all at once, as if by some invisible cue, some silent chord strummed in the air, their next turn. Their mouths part, and their eyes finally land on you, not out of love or admiration, but out of fear, suspicion, and the eerie sense that maybe, just maybe, the person they thought they knew is someone else entirely. That moment happened to me at exactly 7:43 in the evening, give or take a minute, while my sister's cheek rested in a puddle of gravy, her expensive lipstick bleeding into mashed potatoes, and Jason's trembling voice kept repeating her name like it might bring her back. The room, moments before thick with meaningless chatter and the clinking of dull silverware, had fallen into a silence so dense it seemed to suck the air out of everyone's lungs. My mother stood frozen beside her chair, one hand gripping the backrest so tightly that her knuckles turned white, while Lily sat wide-eyed, her fingers still curled around her fork as if waiting for a cue that dinner was to resume. And me? I reached for my napkin, dabbed the corner of my mouth with the calm precision of someone raised on etiquette books and passive-aggressive silences, and leaned back in my chair just slightly, enough to see the whole scene without leaning into it, enough to make them wonder. Jason was the first to move beyond just noise. He shook Emily's shoulders, gently at first, then harder, his voice pitching up in panic as her limp body refused to respond, and her breathing became shallow and erratic. I watched the way his hands gripped her, not lovingly but desperately, like he was trying to wake up a bad dream, like he thought maybe if he said her name enough times, she'd smile that practiced little smile and roll her eyes and say something sarcastic about drama and attention. But she didn't. She didn't say a damn thing. And I just sat there, watching it all unravel, the quiet, controlled chaos of a family too refined to scream, but too shocked to do anything useful. Eventually, someone, probably my mother, had the sense to call for an ambulance, though her voice cracked so badly she had to repeat the address twice. I remember thinking, even then, how strange it was that in all the years this family had circled the wagons around Emily, defended her faults, ignored her cruelty, and celebrated every minor achievement as though she had invented fire. Not one of them seemed to know what to do when she wasn't perfect. They knew how to celebrate her, sure, but they didn't know how to save her. And that, to me, felt almost biblical in its irony. I stood only after they had moved her to the floor, after my mother started crying into her hands and Lily began to sob softly, her shoulders jerking like a child trying not to be loud. I didn't rush, didn't panic, didn't even pretend to be startled. Instead, I stepped around the table and knelt beside my sister, pressing 2 fingers to her wrist as though checking her pulse, not because I was worried she might be dying, but because I wanted them to see me doing something ambiguous, something careful, something that could be read any number of ways depending on how deeply you needed to believe I was innocent. She's breathing, I said quietly, almost thoughtfully, as if delivering a piece of mildly good news that should be acknowledged but not celebrated. Jason looked at me then, eyes wide, his face flushed with confusion and accusation and something else, something I couldn't quite name, maybe disbelief or dread or guilt. My mother's voice came next, broken and high-pitched, filled with questions that didn't make sense, asking what happened, if it was something she ate, if it was the wine, if Emily had taken her medication that morning. I listened to the frantic voices, the half-finished sentences, and the wild guesses being thrown like darts at a wall of ignorance, and I felt the strangest thing rise in my chest, not guilt, not yet, but something like satisfaction, dark and quiet and warm. Like slipping into a hot bath after a long day spent being invisible. They didn't ask me what I thought. Not at first. It was as if, even then, their minds couldn't bend far enough to include me in the picture, as if the idea that I might have been involved in any of it was so absurd it didn't even warrant suspicion. That, of course, was part of the brilliance of it, the fact that I was so forgettable, so unthreatening, so reliably disappointing, that no one ever imagined I might be capable of doing something deliberate. I was the one who brought store-bought cupcakes to potlucks, who offered to watch Lily when no one else wanted to, who paid my mother's cable bill when her card declined, but never told a soul. I was wallpaper. Until I wasn't. When the paramedics arrived, the lights of their truck spilling into the windows and washing everything in a sterile red and blue glow, I stood back and let them work. Emily was semi-conscious by then, mumbling incoherently and trying to sit up, her movements uncoordinated and sluggish. They strapped her to a gurney with calm professionalism, asked questions no one could answer, and wheeled her out the front door while Jason followed close behind, clutching her purse and murmuring promises she couldn't hear. Once they were gone, the house felt hollow, like the walls themselves were holding their breath. My mother turned to me, finally, her face pale and trembling, and asked me in a whisper if I thought she would be all right. I nodded once, not smiling, not reassuring, just enough to give her something to hold on to. I didn't say that Emily would recover. I didn't say she wouldn't. I said nothing of the sort. Because the truth, the whole, bare, ugly truth, was that I had done exactly what I intended to do. And no one had noticed. Not yet. It wasn't poison. Not exactly. And it wasn't some elaborate concoction brewed in a basement with rubber gloves and a wicked laugh. What I used was something far simpler, something legal, something even Emily herself had once recommended I take when I complained about stress and insomnia, St. John's wort, a harmless-sounding herb that can, in just the right dose, when paired with wine and a few days of sleep deprivation, create a storm of neurological chaos. I hadn't spiked her drink. I hadn't laced her food. I had simply placed the opportunity in front of her and let her take it. I had known she would. That's the thing about people like Emily. They think everything belongs to them, even the things meant for someone else. So, when she reached for the glass meant for me, she took more than wine. She took everything I had been holding in for years. The hurt, the silence, the erasure. And I, for once, let her carry it. Hospitals, no matter how clean they try to make them, no matter how fresh the flowers on the counter or how bright the vending machine lights, always smell the same, like bleach and metal and fear that's been scrubbed 1,000 times and still lingers in the grout. I didn't go to the ER that night, of course. That would have been too obvious, too dramatic, and frankly, too generous. Instead, I drove home in silence, turned off my phone, and watched old reruns of shows no one cares about anymore while the news of Emily's medical episode surely rippled through the family chat threads that rarely included me unless someone needed a casserole or a last-minute babysitter. The next morning, there was a text from my mother that read, "She's stable. Doctors say it might be stress. Or blood sugar. Or something hormonal." I stared at that message for a long time, the way you look at a mosquito on the wall deciding whether to kill it now or wait until it lands somewhere more satisfying. No mention of the dinner. No apology for the gift. No acknowledgement that anything unusual had happened between me and the rest of them the night before. Just a smooth, forgettable sentence meant to brush the whole thing under a rug woven with decades of denial. It was fascinating to me, in a clinical way almost, how quickly they returned to their roles. Jason sent a thank you for being there message with too many exclamation marks and none of the direct questions I have hoped he might ask. Lily posted a dance video on social media by mid-afternoon, with no hint that her mother had collapsed face-first into dinner less than 24 hours earlier. And my mother, the queen of selective amnesia, was already in full defense mode, telling her bridge group that Emily had a little spell and that the doctors weren't worried. But I remembered everything. Not just the glass. Not just the slumping. I remembered all of it. The whole goddamn catalog of things they thought I'd forgotten, or worse, forgiven. I remembered being 10 years old and asking for a microscope for Christmas, only to be told it was too expensive, then watching Emily unwrap a karaoke machine the same morning, complete with a pink stand and glittered microphone. I remembered my 16th birthday, when my mother forgot entirely and Emily insisted I didn't need a party because I wasn't really that type of girl. I remembered missing prom because the dress money was reallocated when Emily decided she needed to fly out to visit a college boyfriend she was certain she'd marry. And I remembered when Dad died, how Emily had taken charge of the funeral arrangements without asking, deciding which photos went in the program and which ones didn't, editing our grief like a script she got to direct. There were moments they forgot, so many of them, stacked like plates no one bothered to rinse. And I had been drying each one off in my mind for years, cataloging the fingerprints left behind, the smudges of disregard, the little insults disguised as affection. I decided to stop by Emily's house the next day, under the pretense of checking on her, bringing soup I didn't make and tea I didn't believe in. Jason opened the door, looking tired, with that defensive politeness people use when they don't know whether to hug you or keep you at arm's length. Emily was on the couch, pale but alert, wrapped in a blanket far more expensive than anything I owned, sipping something herbal from a mug that said, "Best Mom Ever," in loopy gold letters. She looked up, saw me, and for a moment, just one moment, there was something in her eyes that I hadn't seen since we were children. Not fear. Not anger. Something closer to wariness, like she couldn't quite decide whether I was a threat or just another item on her to-do list. "Karen," she said, voice hoarse but steady. "That was weird, right? Last night." I smiled, the way someone does when they're trying very hard not to scream in church. "I think you've just been pushing too hard. Your body's telling you to slow down," I said softly, setting the soup on the table and watching her closely. She nodded, still watching me, and then looked down at her mug, as if suddenly unsure of what was inside. That flicker of hesitation, so small most people wouldn't catch it, was all I needed to see. That seed had been planted. And it would grow. Not fast. Not all at once. But it would take root in her, creeping like ivy through the cracks of her curated life. Over the next week, Emily's texts became shorter. Her calls came at strange hours. Jason confided to our mother that Emily wasn't sleeping well, that she'd been forgetting things, names, appointments, even where she'd parked her car in their own driveway. She started misplacing items, then accusing Jason of moving them. She left the stove on twice. She cried over a broken shoelace. The cracks were subtle, but they were spreading. And no one could explain them. Because there was no clinical reason, no test, no diagnosis that could account for what was happening to her. And that, of course, was the brilliance of it. I never touched her medicine. Never added anything to her food. I didn't even brew the tea myself. All I did was leave small gifts around her home, old things, forgotten things, pieces of our shared past that she had tried to erase, but that I had kept, like relics from a war she pretended never happened. A postcard from our trip to the coast with Dad, one she had torn in half during a tantrum over bunk bed assignments. A copy of the cassette tape she'd made in high school, singing badly off-key, which she had sworn she destroyed. A letter Dad had written me before he died, one she had hidden in the bottom drawer of his desk because he had signed it "My First Girl." Each item was carefully placed where she'd find it, not immediately, not suspiciously, but just soon enough to disrupt her constructed reality. And when she'd ask, "Did you leave this here?" I'd tilt my head and say, "Oh, I thought it was yours." She started looking at me differently after that, as if I were someone she didn't quite recognize, someone who knew things she had forgotten, someone who might not be entirely safe. And for the first time in our lives, I could see the balance of power shifting, inch by inch, away from her and toward me. But this wasn't about scaring her. Not entirely. This was about waking her up. Because for all the years I had spent being overlooked, spoken over, left behind, there was one thing I had always known with absolute certainty. People like Emily don't apologize. They don't acknowledge the wreckage they cause. They don't fix what they break. But they do unravel. All you have to do is let them. There are moments in life so thick with unspoken truths that even the air feels heavier, as though it's taken on the weight of every unsaid word, every swallowed insult, every small betrayal that was never fully acknowledged but never truly forgotten either. And the strange thing about those moments is how ordinary they often look on the outside, how calm the surface remains even as something underneath begins to churn and heat and bubble, ready to burst at the slightest provocation. The first real shift, tangible and unmistakable, came a week after the dinner, when Jason knocked on my door one evening with that look on his face that people get when they think they've finally found the missing puzzle piece, only to realize the piece doesn't quite fit, but they're too afraid to admit they've been staring at the wrong image the whole time. It was nearly 8, and I was still wearing my work clothes, a faded cardigan and a blouse that had seen better years, sitting at the kitchen table with a glass of wine and a half-finished crossword puzzle, pretending I wasn't waiting for something to happen. Jason stood in the doorway for a moment before stepping inside, his hand hesitating on the knob like he expected resistance, and when I offered him a seat and poured him a glass of the same cheap red I always bought, he looked at it like it might be laced with arsenic. He didn't come right out and accuse me, not at first. Men like Jason, polished and professional, always circle the subject as if confrontation might be contagious, and so he started by asking vague questions about Emily's health, whether I had noticed anything unusual leading up to the dinner, whether she'd mentioned stress or anxiety to me recently, and whether I thought it was possible that she was experiencing some kind of breakdown. I nodded slowly, occasionally offering a neutral word or two, knowing full well that what he really wanted wasn't information, but confirmation that I, like everyone else, believed Emily's unraveling was purely internal. Some unfortunate psychological hiccup that could be explained by hormones or fatigue or the mystical fog of womanhood that men like him always fall back on when they don't know what the hell is happening. But then, about 10 minutes in, he shifted in his seat, leaned forward just slightly, and asked me, too casually, if I remembered switching the wine glasses that night. There it was. The question, so carefully posed that it didn't quite sound like an accusation, but more like a dare, as though he was watching for a flicker in my eyes, some nervous tick, some tightening of the jaw that would tell him whether or not his suspicion had finally landed somewhere solid. I took a slow sip of my wine, swallowed, and met his gaze with a kind of stillness that I had spent years perfecting, the kind that says I see you without offering anything in return. I might have, I said finally, letting the words hang in the air like wet laundry, not denying, not confessing, just acknowledging that something had happened which may or may not be significant depending on the lens through which it was viewed. I thought mine looked cloudy. Maybe the dishwasher didn't rinse properly. He nodded, slowly, and looked down at his glass, his lips pressing into a thin, unhappy line. He didn't ask any more questions after that. He just sat there a while longer, nursing his drink, and then stood to leave with a brief thank you and a look that hovered somewhere between suspicion and guilt. When the door closed behind him, I exhaled, not from relief, but from the peculiar satisfaction of knowing that, for once, the narrative was no longer solely theirs to write. In the days that followed, Emily's condition plateaued into something more manageable, but no less troubling. She was functional. Yes, she could walk, talk, attend to basic needs, but there was a slowness to her now, a hesitation that hadn't been there before, as if every decision required just a little more effort, as if the bright, effortless efficiency that had once defined her had been dimmed like a light bulb flickering behind old glass. She forgot names. She lost her keys. She repeated herself in conversation and then laughed nervously, as though trying to mask the fear pooling beneath her ribs. My mother, ever the loyal curator of illusion, insisted that Emily was simply overworked and needed rest, and began pushing for a weekend trip to the mountains, some family bonding time where everything could be reset and smoothed over and swept clean. But even she couldn't ignore the way Emily had started to watch me during conversations, eyes narrowed slightly, as though trying to remember something important, something crucial that sat just out of reach. I didn't look away when she stared. I didn't blink. I let her look, let her search, let her ask with her eyes the questions she couldn't form with her mouth, because I wanted her to feel it, that same weight I had carried for years, the weight of uncertainty. Of feeling like you're always one step behind in a game someone else is playing. There was a moment, during that weekend trip, when she pulled me aside while the others were out hiking. We were alone on the porch, the wind cutting through the trees like a whisper you're not sure you heard. She reached into the pocket of her jacket, pulled out a small tin of herbal supplements, and held them out to me with shaking fingers. "Did you give me something?" she asked, voice so low it was barely audible. I took the tin from her hand, turned it over slowly, and smiled, not cruelly, not kindly either, but with the kind of expression you wear when you realize the balance has finally shifted. "I think you've just been pushing too hard," I said again, repeating the phrase I had offered once before, knowing exactly how much weight it would carry now. "Your body's telling you to slow down." She stared at me, and I saw the flicker again, that flash of recognition, of suspicion, of fear wrapped in disbelief. But she didn't accuse me. She didn't scream. She didn't run. Because people like Emily don't confront things head-on. They manipulate, they maneuver, they edit. And now that those tools were failing her, she had nothing left but the silence. Later that night, when we sat around the fire and toasted to healing and fresh starts, I lifted my glass and met her eyes, letting the flames reflect in both our faces. And in that moment, I realized something I hadn't dared admit before. This wasn't about revenge anymore. It was about balance. About taking back something I should have had all along. Not attention. Not praise. Just space. Space to exist, to be seen, to matter. And for the first time in my life, I felt like I was finally getting what I deserved. The final unraveling didn't happen in a blaze of drama, as one might expect from a family built on subtle cruelty and polished denial, but rather in a slow, aching collapse of pretense, like watching an elegant house of cards give way to the inevitability of breath and gravity, a structure so fragile that even the slightest shift in air reveals its hollowness. In the end, it wasn't the glass, or the dinner, or the whispered suspicions that brought everything crashing down. It was the moment when silence could no longer bear the weight of what had been buried beneath it for decades. And the people who had once looked at me with vague affection or practiced indifference began to realize they had never really looked at me at all. It began with a knock at the door, early morning, unwelcome and oddly restrained, as though the person on the other side wasn't entirely sure whether they wanted to be let in or simply wanted the act of knocking to be their final gesture. When I opened the door, it was Jason again, but this time he looked less composed, less polished, his collar slightly wrinkled and his eyes shaded with the kind of exhaustion that can't be explained by lack of sleep alone. He didn't wait to be invited in. He stepped across the threshold like a man walking into a courtroom, unsure if he was a witness or a defendant. He didn't sit down this time. He stood near the window, hands in his pockets, looking out into the gray morning as if hoping that the overcast sky might offer him clarity. And then, without preamble, he said it. "I found the bottle," he began, his voice low but firm, like he'd practiced the sentence several times on the way over. "The one with the dried herbs. Hidden in the back of your pantry, behind the rice." I didn't pretend not to know what he meant. That would have been insulting to both of us. Instead, I closed the door softly behind me, walked to the table, and poured myself a cup of coffee, the slow rhythm of the act grounding me in a way that words could not. "St. John's wort," I said, turning the cup in my hands. "It's an herbal supplement. Perfectly legal. Found it at the health store. Emily used to recommend it." Jason turned from the window then, and for the first time, I saw not accusation in his eyes, but something closer to desperation, as though he had reached the limit of what he could ignore and still call himself innocent. "She's not the same," he said. "She's paranoid. Detached. She thinks she's being watched. She forgets things, then remembers them all at once. She's not sleeping. She asked me if I thought someone was following her. She doesn't even trust Lily anymore." I said nothing. Not yet. I let his words hang between us like a fog, thick and unresolved. "You didn't poison her," he added quickly, as if trying to reassure himself. "I know that. But you wanted her to feel something. To doubt herself. To live in the space you've been living in." It wasn't a question. It was a confession. Not of guilt, not entirely, but of awareness. Jason, for all his distance and aloof charm, had finally pieced together the truth, not just about what I had done, but why. And I think, in some part of him he hadn't admitted out loud yet, he understood it. "You want me to be sorry," I said after a long silence, "but I'm not. Not for the glass. Not for the herbs. Not even for letting her drink what was meant for me. Because what I gave her wasn't poison, it was a mirror. And she's not used to seeing herself the way I've always seen her." He sat down then, heavily, as if the truth had weight, as if the act of finally acknowledging it had taken something from him. He didn't argue. He didn't accuse. And that, more than anything, confirmed for me that it was over. That the game we'd all been playing without rules or names had finally run its course. When he left, he didn't say goodbye. Just stood up, nodded once, and walked out, leaving the door open behind him like a chapter left unfinished. And I didn't close it right away. I stood there for a moment, coffee in hand, watching the wind tug at the edges of my porch furniture, the early light creeping in like an old friend too cautious to embrace. Later that week, we gathered again, this time for Emily's birthday. The irony wasn't lost on me. The same occasion that had, for years, been paraded in front of me like a crown I'd never earn was now unfolding with less fanfare than usual. Emily looked tired. Diminished. Her hair was pulled back too tightly, and her smile was a strained echo of its former self. She barely touched her wine, and when I reached across the table to refill her glass, she moved it aside without a word. The dinner was quiet. No speeches. No toasts. Just the clinking of forks and the occasional forced laugh from my mother, who had apparently decided that ignoring the elephant in the room was still her strongest skill. And then, as we moved to the living room, as cake was cut and presents were opened, Emily turned to me. Just a glance, no words. But in that glance was a universe of unspoken things, accusations, regrets, a strange cocktail of resentment and respect. She knew. She didn't know everything, maybe not the details, but she knew enough. And she also knew that there was nothing she could say, no public confrontation that wouldn't unravel the whole carefully constructed image she had built. So instead, she said thank you. Not loudly. Not to everyone. Just to me. I looked at her, held her gaze, and said nothing. Because I had already said everything I needed to say by doing exactly what I did and nothing more. In the end, I didn't destroy her. I didn't even want to. I simply shifted the balance. I turned the weight of years around and handed it back to her, one carefully wrapped moment at a time, until she could no longer pretend it hadn't existed. And now, when they look at me, my mother, Jason, even Lily, they look with caution. With a kind of reverence I've never received before. Not because they love me, but because they've finally learned that even the quiet ones have limits. Even the invisible ones can choose to be seen. And maybe that's the real ending. Not a courtroom. Not a confession. Just a single moment. A woman pushing her plate away. And everyone finally noticing.